The mainstream focus has turned to seriously consider the Wuhan lab leak hypothesis. Welcome to the party, guys. What kept you? The UK Prime Minister's former #1 aide, Dominic Cummings, unleashes a massive attack on the government's competence in handling the pandemic, and oil company Shell is told by a court that it has to cut its emissions nearly in half in the next 10 years. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Suddenly, 3 months after I first covered the emerging evidence behind it on this channel, the COVID lab leak hypothesis is all over the news. This week, President Joe Biden ordered the intelligence agencies to report to him in the next 3 months on the origins of COVID-19. This came after a released US intelligence report suggested that 3 researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology had required hospital care in November 2019, a month before China says the first case of COVID-19 was detected in Wuhan. A senior White House coronavirus advisor, Andy Slavitt, expressed his frustrations about the events to date. "We need to get to the bottom of this, and we need a completely transparent process from China. We need the WHO to assist us in that matter. We don't feel like we have that now." This also followed the publication last week of a letter to the journal Science of a number of scientists calling for an open investigation into the origins of COVID-19. Theories of accidental release from a lab and zoonotic spillover both remain viable. One of the signatories was Ralph S. Barrich, who has a huge pedigree of research into coronaviruses. Indeed, Barrich has carried out research in collaboration with the Wuhan lab in the past, the results of which were published in a 2015 paper carrying both his name and Zhengli Shi of the Institute. So it is hugely significant that he lined up for this letter, effectively calling for the Institute to be properly investigated, and he did so alongside Alina Chan, the young researcher that had done a lot of the investigative work that I described in my previous video. And so suddenly it seems sensible people are allowed to talk about the hypothesis after all. How do we know? Well, Facebook has declared that posts on the subject will no longer be banned, which leads you to think that maybe they should never have been banned in the first place, which strangely seems not to have occurred to them. And you can see some sensible people working their way through the cognitive dissonance whereby the hypothesis they clearly defined as being an indicator of unquestioned wrongness, shall we say, had suddenly become respectable. For instance, this tweet I noticed from a climate scientist. "I've noticed a lot of folks I used to trust jumping on this bandwagon. Is there actually any credible source, i.e. person with expertise on viruses, that has suggested there's any evidence that COVID-19 was created in a lab?" I love that. Folks I used to trust, implying that the mere fact that they were talking about the lab leak hypothesis meant that he didn't trust them anymore. Of course, still in that tweet there's the confusion between some of the early, wilder claims that COVID was created from scratch in a lab, which has never been credible, to the idea that it was studied in a lab and potentially enhanced through gain-of-function research. Gain-of-function research is where, at its most simplistic level, you think, wouldn't it be terrible if a coronavirus emerged that had the power to transmit easily from human to human? Let's give an existing virus that capability so we can study how we'd protect against it. One of the people that's been talking about this has been Dr. Anthony Fauci, the face of virus science. He startled a number of people this week when he answered the question, "Are you still confident the virus developed naturally?" with this answer: "No, actually, I am not convinced about that. I think we should continue to investigate what went on in China until we find out to the best of our ability exactly what happened." Now, I always respect anyone who's prepared to change their mind and to clearly say so, especially in an environment of febrile interest. But, this is a puzzling one. It was about this time last year that Fauci said to National Geographic, "If you look at the evolution of the virus in bats, what's out there now is very, very strongly leaning toward this virus could not have been artificially or deliberately manipulated." Not only that, the article said, he also doesn't entertain an alternate theory that someone found the coronavirus in the wild, brought it to a lab, and then it accidentally escaped. Now, Fauci is not some rando politician who doesn't know anything about the field before it burst onto all of our radars. So how did he end up putting forward a position that says, if you look at the published peer-reviewed scientific literature, a theory was impossible, when in fact, when you did that, you found it was perfectly plausible? In recent weeks, Fauci had been pressed by Rand Paul over whether US funds had flowed to the Wuhan Institute to fund gain-of-function research. He had strongly and consistently denied that to be the case. Following an exchange earlier this month, the UK's Independent said this: an infuriated Dr. Anthony Fauci told Senator Rand Paul that he was entirely and completely incorrect for accusing federal agencies of funding Wuhan's Institute of Virology and the development of COVID. During a congressional hearing on the coronavirus on Tuesday, Mr. Paul falsely accused federal agencies of funding gain-of-function research in Wuhan, forcing Dr. Fauci to call out the conspiracy. When you talk about media bias, you can look at that last paragraph. I really think it's time that journalists just stopped randomly adding the word falsely to everything. Rand Paul falsely accused agencies. How do you know it's false? If you're a journalist, report the accusation, report the response. You're not the judge. You don't get to decide what's false and what isn't. Because it then turns out that the National Institute of Health did funnel payments via the EcoHealth Alliance to the Wuhan lab. But Fauci emphatically said this wasn't to fund gain-of-function research. Well, Republican Senator John Kennedy asked Fauci this: how do you know they didn't lie to you and use the money for gain-of-function research anyway? Fauci said there was no way to guarantee that the scientists and the grantees did not lie. Because since in order to get the grant you have to say you're not going to do gain-of-function, it's always possible they might have, said that in order to get the money. Fauci said the scientists at the lab are trustworthy and he would expect they complied with the conditions of the grants. He was asked whether the Chinese government, authoritarian government, arrests doctors for publishing that there's a growing pandemic, that government, whether it might have interfered in some way. He said, I don't have enough insight into the Communist Party in China to know the interactions between them and the scientists. Not an answer likely to satisfy the critics, and sure enough, a number of Republicans have been calling for Fauci to resign. The timing of all this was not accidental. The decision-making body of the World Health Organization is about to announce its next step in a broader investigation into the pandemic origins. To head this off, China announced in a meeting of the World Health Assembly that as far as it's concerned, the probe into COVID origins in China is now complete, and it thinks the international community should think about investigating some other countries. And consequently, it's not going to participate in or support a second phase that aims to take investigators to Wuhan. It's not as though the investigators that took part in the first one were full of glowing tales of how cooperative China had been. And reportedly, it was this move by China that prompted Biden to have the intelligence report highlighting the lab leak evidence declassified. This should put the WHO under considerably more pressure to resist China's fight back. Now, in other news, the Prime Minister's former number one aide, Dominic Cummings, was testifying this week on all the things the government did wrong in managing the pandemic. It was a long list, but all based on a particular perspective of the sort of approach that Cummings felt would be more effective. We'll get to that in just a moment. But first, that overall question about how we should have managed the pandemic often draws on historical parallels. People sometimes refer to the Spanish influenza outbreak in 1918-1919, but that doesn't really match because it was a much more deadly pandemic. The world was just emerging, desperately weakened from the most devastating world war in history to that date. A closer match would be the influenza epidemic of 1957-58. The infectiousness and the fatality rate were a lot closer to what we've seen with COVID-19. What, you've never heard of that pandemic? Possibly not. How it was handled was very different. I thought it would be interesting to look at the parallels and the sharp divergences of what we did then versus what we did this time. Are there any lessons we can learn? Are there any challenges to our preconceptions that it leaves us with? I think you're going to find it very interesting. If you think you might too, then join me for that video going live at 7 PM UK time next Monday. See you then. The UK was gripped I tell you, by the positively Shakespearean drama of the Prime Minister's former top aide, and many suggested really the only intellectual driving force in the Johnson government at the time, Dominic Cummings, turning on his former colleagues in hours upon hours of testimony to a parliamentary committee. Boris Johnson was labelled as unfit for his office. He'd completely dismissed COVID in the early days as a scare story. Officials had to work around him to get things done. The Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, should have been fired for at least 15 or 20 things, not least because he couldn't stop lying. And he was responsible for COVID being sent out into the care homes. And so on and so on. It was relentless. It was an early foretaste of what's going to come when a proper public inquiry eventually gets underway to look into what was and what wasn't done right in the pandemic. And it might well be an indicator that the push is all going to go one way. Dominic Cummings was in no doubt that what should have been done was faster, harder locking down at the start. And if only that could have been done, thousands of lives would have been saved. The second wave could even possibly have been averted. If there's a possible inquiry, you would hope that assumption, because it is an assumption, would get rigorously tested. As things have settled out so far with COVID-19, and it's still not quite over, remember, many of those countries that seemed in the earlier days to be doing better have actually now closed the gap on us significantly. And even Taiwan, which Cummings praised for its early actions in closing its borders, has just seen a jump in cases because it's really hard to permanently keep something like this from leaking into your country. According to reports, believing that nothing could pass its strong borders, the authorities, the medical establishment and the people generally became complacent. They stopped aggressively testing, even when people had the symptoms of fever. For a country like the UK, with so much of its business dependent on international trade, it's hard to see how the country would have successfully shut its borders for long to COVID-19. Maybe different policy could have meant that we were hit less hard. Maybe. Countries that were hard hit vary enormously in how they responded, and the truth is likely to be that public policy choices will turn out to have been a lot less important, not completely irrelevant, but less important than many people assume. Of course, you probably still don't want an incompetent shambles at the head of your government when you're in a crisis, but it's not as though it's news. You know, the government's incompetence has been evident at various points. Since then, the government won a set of local elections very handily, so you can't imagine that Cummings' broadsides are ultimately going to leave much of a mark, even if you feel that it would be fair if they did. In other news, Royal Dutch Shell had an interesting day in court this week. A Dutch court declared that the company had helped drive dangerous climate change and ordered it to cut its own CO2 emissions and those of its suppliers and customers by 45% by the end of 2030. This was the result of a lawsuit brought by environmental campaigners, and it comes after the company had already pledged to cut the carbon intensity of its products by 20%. It's now been told to more than double that. The ruling was hailed, as you can imagine, by the campaigners, although obviously it does not set any legal precedent outside the Netherlands. It also doesn't make a huge amount of sense outside of a fairly blunt symbolism. The point is that various governments are signing up to net zero carbon energy, many by 2050, and how that will happen is that they will invest in alternative energy sources, they replace petrol vehicles with electric ones and all the rest of it. Assuming that rolls out as planned, oil companies will be left managing a declining market. Demand for their products will begin to go down, they will seek to diversify into new technologies, which they're already starting to do. None of that process involves innovation to reduce the carbon emissions from oil by 45%. It's hard to see how you would do that, and it's certainly not worth the money to try, given that it's a declining market that's intended to hit zero within decades. No doubt such arguments will be put forward by Shell when it appeals the decision, as it is expected to do. And I personally would hope they win the appeal. The idea that you get courts to impose declining shares of emissions on every company, it is such a rigid, unintelligent way to manage that process of change, only campaigners could really think it was a good idea. In the US, meanwhile, a small activist investor group forced Exxon Mobil to install 2 of its nominees onto its board, who were pledged to push a more active approach to managing environmental and social governance issues at the company. It was able to do this because it won the support of the world's largest asset manager, BlackRock. BlackRock gave a stinging rebuke to the company to justify its vote. Exxon and its board needs to further assess the company's strategy and board expertise against the possibility that demand for fossil fuels may decline rapidly in the coming decades. The company's current reluctance to do so presents a corporate governance issue that has the potential to undermine the company's long-term financial sustainability. Now, let's be clear, both of these events were hailed more for their symbolic impact more than anything else, but it's an indication how various institutions are now increasingly looking ahead to the future low-carbon energy world and starting to make clear that this is the direction of travel, whether you happen to like it or not. Another part of society enduring an extended wake-up call is that of cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies were banned in Iran this week after the Bitcoin miners delivered crippling power cuts to their host country. Iran has seen a rapid expansion of cryptocurrency mining operations as cheap electricity was attractive to operators, and the state encouraged it because of a possibility that digital currencies might be a route to avoiding American sanctions. But the impact on the power grid has become too severe, with frequent power cuts. One high-level visiting Chinese delegation was left in the dark after the lights went out. People have shared videos of people dangling helplessly from the top of an amusement park ride when the power failed there. The move is the latest sign that cryptocurrency based on massive computer-intensive operations is not likely to become the surviving model into the future. Now, in a minute, we'll reply to a couple of comments and move on to the final thought for the week. But first, let's talk about doom. There's lots of people that have been talking about not much else for the last few years. Catastrophic climate change, cataclysmic COVID pandemics. Niall Ferguson, which is spelled Niall Ferguson. In other words, not the epidemiologist with the doomy COVID projections, but the very interesting historian. He has recently published a book called Doom, the Politics of Catastrophe. He looks at the history of catastrophic events throughout human history and asks what we can really learn from them. There will always be catastrophes that come along. The vast majority of people survive them. We often do very similar things in how we respond to them. And, we really should be thinking about where the next one might come from. And here's a clue. It's not going to be climate change. So anyway, I'm going to be doing my usual half book review, but really more of a discussion of the issues that the book covers type videos. Believe me, it's fascinating stuff. It's very important. You won't want to miss it. So join me for that one, going live on his channel at 7 p.m. UK time on Wednesday next week. See you then. I had this comment after last week's roundup video, which included the segment on Israel and Hamas. Your framing of Israel's wanton destruction and slaughter as all about Hamas and their internal politics was atrocious. You seem to have a cavernous assessment blind spot on this region. I understand that whenever we get these highly polarised conflicts, it's difficult to step back with non-judgmental analysis. What I did in that segment was I explained what motivated each active group based on what we know. And I added a little on whether they were likely to be successful. I noted the high levels of outrage by the partisans on each side, made passing reference to the framing they were making. I did not pass judgment on anybody, because, really you shouldn't have to. Okay, killing people is bad. Does it add any levels of insight for me to spend the first 2 minutes talking about how bad it is? Maybe. It's not how I tend to deal with stories generally. Hamas took the first move. I talked about why they did that based on recent political events. Israel responded with overwhelming force. I talked about why they did that. I get that if your perspective is simply that one side is brutal and evil and they did what they did purely for the sake of wanton destruction, then all of that is going to seem unsatisfactory. And I get that if your favoured side was the first to throw bombs around, then observing that fact might feel like it's making some kind of moralistic point. But it's also just, reporting what happened. I've never seen a shooting war where neither side did something reprehensible at some point. War is ugly. This one is no different. I talked about it to try to explain what happened, not to preach. You're grown-ups. You can decide which side, if either, you feel has the moral high ground. Another comment, this one from the Ivermectin video. Have you considered the other major disincentive in the recommendation of Ivermectin, that the US emergency use approval for vaccines is given conditional on the lack of an effective drug treatment alternative? There is a lot of money in the vaccines, and it would be an awful shame if their rollout was put on hold for a few years because Ivermectin exists. Yes, I'd heard speculation on this. I just didn't think that element was very credible. I don't think such a detail was going to be used to block the development of the vaccines on a technicality in a pandemic. This week, we've seen various mainstream media figures saying that the only reason why nobody would listen to the lab leak hypothesis was because Trump had said it, so they weren't going to give it the time of day. And that same factor was in play here. A lot of people treated this as a toxic area because they associated it with Trump-like people championing their favourite wonder drugs of choice, mostly based on misinformation. Now, Merck is different. Merck had its own reasons. I talked about those in the video. But I think others just responded in the usual tribal way, making assumptions based on that idea's associations with people on the other side. It's evidence that nobody's really following the science. They may think they are. They're really just following their own peer group-based social cues. And this is very normal. It's all you really need to explain how we got here. On October the 5th, 1938, Winston Churchill made a speech to the House of Commons warning about the rising Nazi menace in Germany and shredding the arguments in favour of appeasement. The speech was not considered helpful. It was out of the mood of its times. Churchill was labelled as an alarmist, hilariously enough, and he was considered toxic. Very few were tempted to consider what he said seriously, or especially to associate themselves in any way with him or his ideas. There was even a strong possibility he was going to be deselected from his parliamentary seat before the next election. Until all that changed, of course. And the reality of Hitler broke through the groupthink that had managed to talk itself into such complacency. Nothing could be much clearer than the fact we have examples of similar groupthink everywhere where we look today. In his testimony to the Parliamentary Committee this week, Dominic Cummings talked about how the pre-existing pandemic plans had been deeply flawed because there had been no effort made to turn to dissenting experts with minority arguments who could test its assumptions. Now, he missed his own groupthink, assuming that lockdowns must be the answer and that the scientific advisory body simply needed to be bolder and quicker in imposing them. But giving power to the specialists who deal with just one aspect of a problem is not a way to deal with a big overarching problem. The SAGE group should have reported to a higher body that would have considered the scientists' advice alongside the social and economic factors. As it is, we now have a massive backlog of patients needing support for other issues. 20,000 pupils disappeared from school rolls after lockdown, and so many other things besides. Maybe we would have concluded that that was the price that had to be paid. Who knows? But unless you consider the costs as well as the benefits, you can't make rational decisions. But again, critical voices on this were not encouraged. Critics of lockdowns were treated as cranks at best and dangerous at worst, rather than people whose arguments should be evaluated. That is a shocking failure of governance. And now we have scientists beginning to talk about the likelihood of COVID, starting with a leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I was speaking about this in relative obscurity. Maybe it got my channel shadow banned, who knows? But some of the scientists who spoke out about this in the earlier stages found themselves in considerably more difficulty. The British scientist Angus Dalgleish, a 71-year-old vaccine researcher, told the Times of London this week that he had been ostracised and told just to shut up. People said to me, the biggest problem you have is that Trump agrees with you. Even though he knew nothing about it and didn't understand it, no scientist wanted to get into bed and agree with Trump. And that is a shocking failure of the scientific community, the very antithesis of the scientific method. Cummings said to the committee that what happened in government during the pandemic was a classic example of groupthink in action. The more people from outside attacked, the more people internally said they don't understand, they haven't got access to our information. Whether it's in government, the epidemiological community, the climate science community, increasingly the idea that there is a respectable opinion that you have to hold to be taken seriously, it's a thing that gives the biggest lie to our self-image as a rational society. These recent events show that we need to do better. Look out for the best challenges to your existing beliefs. Evaluate arguments independently of who they're coming from or who else agrees with them. As Richard Feynman said, for a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. All right. Last week I shared the data showing how this channel has been being throttled for traffic in the last couple of months by YouTube, no longer suggesting its videos to people outside of existing viewers and subscribers. And that kicked in soon after the Wuhan lab leak video, amongst others. Was it the cost of talking about things that are held to be bad to talk about? Maybe it was. And does the system then put me back into the mainstream once everyone realises, as they now have, that maybe there was a valid point to be made after all? Nah, of course not. So, as always, I'm immensely grateful to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Thanks to you, I'm able to put in the time to produce 3 videos per week and to focus on the topics that matter, regardless of the possible impact of what the algorithm thinks about it. Would I rather the algorithm were pushing me to a bigger audience with all the associated ad revenue income? Sure. But what's the point if you're not using that reach to talk about the issues that are most important and interesting? If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content I aim to produce here, please go to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.